The cold bit through her torn cloak before the humiliation did. Lady Alina Ashford stood in the center of the Baron's grand drawing-room, her cheeks still burning from where his hand had struck her. The slap had been loud enough that every guest in the room had heard it, loud enough that the string quartet in the corner had faltered mid-note, loud enough that there could be no pretending it hadn't happened. She said nothing. The Baron's face was twisted with a rage that seemed excessive even for a man of his temperament. "You dare," he hissed, his voice shaking. "You dare to refuse me in my own home in front of my guests after everything I have done for you." Alina's silence was not weakness, it was all she had left. She had been the Baron's ward for 3 years, ever since her father's debts had consumed his estate and his life shortly after. The Baron had taken her in with what everyone called charity. He had clothed her, fed her, introduced her to society as though she were his own relation, and in return he had expected gratitude, obedience. And tonight, when he had proposed marriage in front of 50 of the county's most influential families, he had expected her acceptance. She had said no. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a single, quiet word that had somehow managed to carry across the entire room. The second slap came harder than the first. This time Alina tasted blood. Her vision blurred and she felt her legs buckle, but she did not fall. She would not give him that. Her hands, still gloved in the white silk he had purchased for her, clenched at her sides. The emerald ring her mother had given her, the only possession she had managed to keep, pressed into her palm through the fabric. "Ungrateful," the Baron spat. "After everything. After I saved you from the workhouse, from ruin, from the gutters where your father's failures would have left you." The guests watched in frozen silence. Not one of them moved to intervene. Not Lady Hartwick, who had complimented Alina's embroidery just an hour before. Not Lord Pemberton, who had danced with her and called her charming. Not even Miss Hartley, who Alina had thought might be something close to a friend. They watched and they did nothing. "You will leave this house tonight," the Baron said, his voice dropping to something cold and final. "You will take nothing with you that I have given you, not the dresses, not the jewelry, nothing. You came to me with nothing and you will leave with nothing." Alina lifted her chin. Her cheek throbbed, her lip was split, but her eyes, gray as winter fog, met his without flinching. Still, she said nothing. The Baron's butler appeared at the doorway, his face carefully blank. "Sir." "Remove her," the Baron said, turning away as though she had already ceased to exist. "Immediately." The butler did not touch her. He merely gestured toward the door, his expression apologetic in a way that meant nothing, changed nothing. Alina walked. Her legs felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else, but they carried her forward. Through the drawing-room, past the guests who had eaten at the Baron's table and drunk his wine and who now looked at her as though she were already a ghost. The front door opened onto a November night that was bitter even for Yorkshire. Frost had already begun to form on the cobblestones. Alina's thin evening slippers, cream silk, impractical, chosen by the Baron's housekeeper that morning, were not made for walking. The door closed behind her. No cloak, no shawl, no coin. The Baron had been precise in his cruelty. The dress she wore was fine enough to mark her as someone who had once been worth something, but it offered no warmth. The neckline was too low, the sleeves too short, the fabric too delicate. It had been designed for candlelight and admiration, not survival. Alina descended the stone steps carefully. Her breath misted in the air. The Baron's estate sat at the end of a long private road, surrounded by moorland that stretched dark and empty in every direction. The nearest village was 4 miles south. She had walked it once in summer in sturdy boots, and it had taken her nearly 2 hours. She began walking. The road was frozen mud and sharp stones. Within minutes she felt the first tear in her slipper. Within 10 she felt the cold seep through the sole and into her foot. Blood, warm and wet, followed soon after. She did not stop. The wind carried the sound of music from the Baron's house. The quartet had resumed playing. Laughter drifted across the moor, faint and cruel. They were dancing again, drinking again. They had already forgotten her. Alina's hands were numb. Her face ached. Her feet left small dark prints on the frost-pale road. But she kept her spine straight and her head high because no one was watching anymore and dignity was all she had left to choose. The cold did not care about dignity. By the time the lights of the Baron's estate disappeared behind tea, He curve of the hill, Aliner's teeth were chattering so violently she could not have spoken even if she had wanted to. The moorland stretched endlessly ahead. No lights, no shelter, just darkness and wind and the thin, distant possibility of the village that might as well have been on the other side of the world. She pulled her arms tight around herself and kept walking, because stopping meant freezing and freezing meant dying, and she would not give the Baron that satisfaction. Not tonight. Aliner did not know how long she had been walking when she heard the horses. The sound came from behind her, distant at first, hoofbeats muffled by frozen earth, the rumble of carriage wheels cutting through the silence of the moor. She did not turn. She did not have the strength to feel hope or fear. She simply kept moving forward, one foot in front of the other, though her steps had become uneven, her balance uncertain. The cold had stopped hurting. That, she knew dimly, was dangerous. The carriage was moving fast, faster than was safe on a road like this in the dark. She heard a man's voice call out sharp, commanding, and the horses slowed. The wheels ground to a halt somewhere close behind her. Aliner kept walking. She did not know what else to do. "Stop the carriage." The voice was low, clipped, and carried the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience. Aliner heard boots hit the ground, heard rapid footsteps approaching. She tried to quicken her pace, but her legs betrayed her. She stumbled, and this time she could not catch herself. Her knees struck the frozen road. Pain flared bright and immediate through the numbness, and Aliner gasped, the first sound she had made since the Baron's drawing room. Her hands hit the ground, and the thin silk of her gloves tore against the stones. She felt the emerald ring press hard into her palm. "Christ!" The voice was closer now, and then there were hands on her shoulders, large, steady, surprisingly gentle. Aliner flinched. She tried to pull away, but her body would not obey her. The hands remained, holding her upright when she would have collapsed entirely. "Easy," the voice said. "I'm not going to hurt you." Aliner forced her head up. Her vision was blurred from cold or tears or shock, she could not tell, but she could make out the shape of a man kneeling in the road beside her. Tall, dark-haired. His face was shadowed, but his eyes caught the faint moonlight and held it. "Can you stand?" he asked. Aliner tried. Her legs shook violently and she nearly fell again. The man caught her, one arm around her waist, the other steadying her shoulder. He was warm. She had not realized how cold she was until she felt the heat of another person against her. "Thomas," the man called over his shoulder, "bring a blanket now." There was a flurry of activity behind him, another man's voice, the sound of a trunk being opened. Aliner's mind felt slow and thick. She could not make sense of what was happening. The Baron's guests did not stop on dark roads to help disgraced wards. Gentlemen did not kneel in frozen mud to speak to women who had been cast out. "What happened to you?" the man asked. His voice was quieter now, but no less firm. "Who did this?" Aliner opened her mouth, but no words came. Her throat was raw from the cold, and even if it had not been, she would not have known what to say. The truth was too long, too complicated, too humiliating. The man's jaw tightened. His gaze moved over her face, the bruise blooming across her cheek, the split in her lip, the blood that had dried at the corner of her mouth. Then lower to her torn dress, her ruined gloves, her bleeding feet. Something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like anger, though not directed at her. "Here, your grace." An older man appeared at his shoulder, holding a thick wool blanket. The title registered dimly in Aliner's mind. Your grace, a duke then. She had stumbled into the path of a duke. The duke took the blanket and wrapped it around Aliner's shoulders with a care that seemed at odds with the severity of his face. The weight of the wool was almost painful against her frozen skin, but the warmth was immediate and overwhelming. Her body began to shake harder. "She's half frozen," the Duke said, still looking at Aliner but speaking to the man behind him. "How long has the nearest inn been closed?" "The Crown shuttered last spring, your grace. The next is in Whitby, another hour at least." The Duke's expression darkened. He looked back at Aliner, and for a moment he seemed uncertain, the first crack in the absolute control he had displayed since arriving. "Can you tell me your name?" Aliner's lips moved, but no sound emerged. The effort of trying made her sway dangerously. The Duke caught her again, and this time he did not let go. "We're not getting answers from her tonight," he said quietly, as though speaking to himself. "She needs a fire and a surgeon in that order." He paused. Hughes then made a decision. We're taking her to Greystone. Your Grace. I'm aware, Thomas. The Duke's tone left no room for argument. I'm also aware that if we leave her on this road, she'll be dead by morning. Get the carriage ready. Thomas hesitated only a moment before nodding and disappearing. The Duke remained kneeling beside Alina, one hand still steadying her. She could see him more clearly now. His face was lean and angular, his features too stern to be called handsome in any conventional sense. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he was somewhere in his 30s. His clothes were dark and well-made but not ostentatious. Everything about him suggested control, precision, a man who did not act on impulse. And yet here he was, on a frozen road in the middle of the moor, holding up a woman he did not know. I'm going to lift you, he said, his voice gentle in a way that did not match his face. The carriage will be warmer than the road. Can you hear me? Alina managed a small nod. It was all she could give him. The Duke slipped one arm beneath her knees and the other around her back, and then he was lifting her as though she weighed nothing at all. Alina's head fell against his shoulder. She did not mean for it to happen, but she no longer had the strength to hold herself upright. Through the wool of his coat, she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He carried her to the carriage, a dark, elegant thing with a ducal crest on the door that Alina could not quite make out in the darkness. Thomas had already opened the door and laid another blanket across the seat inside. The Duke climbed in carefully, still holding Alina, and settled her onto the cushioned bench as though she were something fragile and valuable. He sat across from her, his expression unreadable. Thomas, send a rider ahead to Greystone. Tell Mrs. Beckett to prepare the Rose Room and send for Dr. Hartwell immediately. Yes, Your Grace. The carriage lurched into motion. Alina's eyes were growing heavy. The warmth after so much cold was pulling her toward unconsciousness. She tried to fight it. She did not know this man, did not know where she was being taken, did not know if this was rescue or simply another kind of danger. The Duke seemed to sense her fear. You're safe, he said quietly. I give you my word, whatever happened to you, whoever hurt you, they will not reach you tonight. Alina wanted to believe him. She wanted to ask who he was, why he had stopped, what he wanted from her. But the questions dissolved before they could form, and the darkness at the edges of her vision crept closer. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was the Duke's face, still watching her with that same expression, controlled, unreadable, but with something underneath it that looked almost like concern. And for the first time since the Baron's hand had struck her face, Alina let herself stop fighting. She surrendered to the dark, and to the unexpected mercy of a stranger who had appeared on a frozen road when no one else would. Alina woke to warmth. It was such an unfamiliar sensation after the night before that for a moment she thought she was dreaming. But dreams did not include the soft weight of linen sheets, or the faint scent of lavender sachets, or the gentle crackling of a fire in a nearby hearth. Dreams did not ache quite so thoroughly in every muscle and bone. She opened her eyes. The room was beautiful. That was her first coherent thought. Pale rose wallpaper covered the walls, decorated with delicate gold filigree. Heavy velvet curtains in a deeper shade of rose were drawn back from tall windows that let in weak morning sunlight. The bed she lay in was larger than any she had ever slept in, with carved posts and a canopy of cream silk. A fire burned steadily in a marble fireplace across the room. Alina tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain shot through her shoulders, her back, her feet. She gasped and fell back against the pillows. Careful, miss. A woman appeared beside the bed so quickly that Alina wondered if she had been sitting there all along. She was perhaps 50, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her dress was simple but well-made, a housekeeper's dress. You've had a rough night of it, the woman said gently. Dr. Hartwell saw to your feet and your hands, but he said you'd be sore for several days yet, the bruising especially. Alina's hand moved instinctively to her face. Her cheek was tender to the touch, swollen. The memories of the previous night came rushing back, the Baron's drawing room, the slap, the road, the cold. And then the Duke, the stranger who had stopped his carriage and carried her to safety. Where am I? Alina's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, rough and painful. Greystone Hall, miss, the Duke of Ashworth's estate. The housekeeper poured water from a pitcher into a glass and offered it to Alina. Or, I'm Mrs. Beckett, the housekeeper here. His Grace brought you in last night near frozen through. Gave us all quite a start, he did. Eleanor took the glass with shaking hands and drank. The water was cool and clean, and it soothed her raw throat. I shouldn't be here. I have no right to impose on His Grace's hospitality. His Grace didn't seem to think it was an imposition, Mrs. Beckett said, her tone matter of fact. He was quite clear that you were to have the best room, the best care, and anything else you might need. Now can you tell me your name, miss? His Grace asked, but you weren't in any state to answer last night. Eleanor hesitated. The Baron's influence extended throughout this county. If word got back to him that she was here, he might cause trouble for the Duke. Or worse, he might come for her himself. Mrs. Beckett seemed to read her hesitation. You don't have to tell me if you're not ready, miss, but I'll say this, I've worked for His Grace for 15 years, and I've never known him to turn away someone in need. Whatever you're running from, you're safe here. Eleanor, she said finally, Eleanor Ashford. Well, Miss Ashford, I've laid out a dress for you on the chair there. Nothing fancy, just something warm and practical. Your own things. Mrs. Beckett's expression grew troubled. Well, there wasn't much to salvage. Dr. Hartwell said your feet need another day or two before you should try walking on them properly, but if you'd like to sit by the fire, I can help you. Eleanor looked down at herself for the first time. She was wearing a clean white nightgown that was not hers, soft and warm. Someone had washed the blood from her hands and bandaged her torn palms. Her feet, she could see beneath the sheets, were similarly wrapped. Shame washed over her. She was a stranger in this house, wearing borrowed clothes, sleeping in a room that surely belonged to someone important. She had nothing to offer in return for this kindness except gratitude, and she was not even certain she knew how to express that anymore. I should speak to His Grace, Eleanor said quietly, to thank him and to explain that I cannot stay. His Grace is expecting you for tea this afternoon if you're well enough, Mrs. Beckett said. For now, let's get you fed and properly settled. You look like you haven't eaten a decent meal in days. Eleanor wanted to protest, but her stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. Mrs. Beckett smiled, the first real smile Eleanor had seen in longer than she could remember. I'll take that as agreement, the housekeeper said. I'll bring up a tray. In the meantime, if you need anything at all, you just ring that bell there on the nightstand. Someone will come straight away. Mrs. Beckett left and Eleanor was alone again. She looked around the room more carefully now. There were books on a shelf near the window, novels, poetry, a volume of Shakespeare. A writing desk sat in the corner, stocked with paper and ink. Fresh flowers stood in a vase on the mantelpiece, despite it being November. Someone lived in this room, or had lived in it. There was a sense of care in every detail that spoke of more than just a guest chamber. Eleanor's gaze fell on the dress Mrs. Beckett had mentioned. It was simple, as promised, a day dress in deep blue wool, practical and warm. Beneath it were undergarments, stockings, and a pair of soft leather slippers. All of it looked new, or nearly so. She thought of her own dress, the cream silk that the Baron had chosen. It had been beautiful and entirely useless. This dress was neither beautiful nor useless. It was meant for living in. The door opened again, and Mrs. Beckett returned with a tray laden with food, warm bread, butter, jam, sliced ham, cheese, fruit, and a pot of tea. It was more food than Eleanor usually ate in an entire day. I couldn't possibly eat all of this, Eleanor protested weakly. Eat what you can, miss. You need your strength. Mrs. Beckett set the tray on a small table beside the bed. I'll come back in an hour to help you dress if you'd like. Eleanor ate slowly, savoring each bite. The bread was fresh and soft, the butter rich and sweet. She had not realized how hungry she was until she started eating. By the time she finished, she had consumed far more than she had thought possible. The hour passed quietly. Eleanor sat by the fire as Mrs. Beckett had suggested, wrapped in a thick shawl and watching the flames dance. Her mind wandered to the Duke. She had only seen him in darkness, only heard his voice for a few minutes. She did not know what kind of man he was, what he might want from her, why he had brought her here. She did not even know what he looked like in daylight. Mrs. Beckett returned and helped Eleanor dress. The blue wool fit reasonably well, though it was slightly loose in the waist. The slippers were soft and did not press against her bandaged feet. When Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror above the dressing table, she barely recognized the woman looking back. The bruise on her cheek was dark purple and yellow, ugly and unmistakable. Her lip was still split, though the swelling had gone down, but her eyes looked different. Not hopeful exactly, but not entirely defeated either. "His Grace is in the library," Mrs. Beckett said. "I'll take you down if you're ready." Alina was not ready, but she nodded anyway. The walk through Greystone Hall was slow and painful. Mrs. Beckett stayed close, ready to steady her if needed. The house was magnificent, all dark wood paneling and oil paintings and thick carpets that muffled their footsteps. It was old wealth, Alina realized, the kind that did not need to announce itself. They reached a set of double doors, and Mrs. Beckett knocked gently before opening them. The library was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls, filled with more books than Alina had ever seen in one place. A fire roared in yet another marble fireplace, and standing near the window, his back to the door, was the Duke. He turned as they entered. Alina's breath caught. In the daylight, the Duke of Ashworth was not handsome in any conventional sense. His face was too angular, his expression too severe. His dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, and there were shadows beneath his eyes that suggested he did not sleep well. He was tall and lean, dressed simply in dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked like a man who had been working, not entertaining. But his eyes, gray like her own, were steady and intelligent and entirely focused on her. "Miss Ashford," he said. His voice was the same as she remembered, low, controlled, with that undercurrent of authority. "Please sit, you shouldn't be standing." He gestured to a chair near the fire, and Alina lowered herself into it carefully. The Duke took the chair opposite, and Mrs. Beckett quietly excused herself. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I owe you my life, Your Grace," Alina said finally. "If you had not stopped your carriage last night, I would have died on that road. I have no way to repay such a debt, but I am more grateful than I can express." The Duke's expression did not change. "You owe me nothing. I did what anyone with a conscience would have done." "Most people with a conscience drove past me last night," Alina said quietly. "You were the only one who stopped." Something flickered in the Duke's eyes, surprise perhaps, or recognition. "Then most people are cowards," he said flatly. "Tell me, Miss Ashford, who did this to you?" Alina's hand moved to her bruised cheek before she could stop herself. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." There was an edge to his voice now, something cold and dangerous that made Alina believe he meant exactly what he said. She looked down at her hands, at the bandages wrapped around her palms. The emerald ring was still there, she realized. Someone had cleaned it and left it on her finger. "I was a ward," Alina said slowly. "My guardian proposed marriage. I refused. He did not take it well." The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And he threw you out, in the middle of the night, in November, without so much as a cloak." "Yes. His name—" Alina met the Duke's gaze. There was something in his eyes that frightened her, not because she thought he would hurt her, but because she thought he might hurt someone else. "With respect, Your Grace, I would prefer not to say. I do not wish to cause trouble." "The trouble has already been caused, Miss Ashford, not by you." "Nevertheless," Alina straightened her spine, calling on the last reserves of the dignity that had carried her through the Baron's drawing-room and down that frozen road. "I will not give you his name. I will not be the cause of a conflict between gentlemen. I have caused enough difficulty already." The Duke studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly. "Very well, I will not press you, but understand this: while you are under my roof, you are under my protection. No one will harm you here. No one will force you to do anything you do not wish to do, and when you are ready to leave, I will make certain you have somewhere safe to go." Alina felt something loosen in her chest, something she had not realized was clenched tight. "Why?" she asked. The question came out before she could stop it. "Why would you do all of this for a stranger?" The Duke was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "Because once someone I cared for was in desperate need of help and I was not there to give it. I cannot change the past, Miss Ashford, but I can make different choices in the present." There was pain in those words, old and carefully contained. Alina recognized it because she carried her own. "I will not impose on your hospitality for long, Your Grace," she said, "but I'm grateful for it more than I can say." You may stay as long as you need to, the Duke replied. Greystone is large enough that you need not fear being in the way. Rest, recover, and when you are ready, we will discuss what comes next. Elinor nodded. She rose from her chair slowly and carefully, and the Duke rose as well. One more thing, Miss Ashford, he said as she turned toward the door. You did not cause this. Whatever happened to you, whatever that man did, it was not your fault. I hope you know that. Elinor's throat tightened. She nodded once, not trusting herself to speak, and left the library. Behind her, the Duke stood alone by the fire, staring into the flames with an expression that Mrs. Beckett, had she seen it, would have recognized. It was the look of a man who had just made a decision. He had no intention of reversing. If you've ever been silenced by someone who had power over you, stay with this story. She didn't speak, but he listened to what she didn't say. 3 days passed at Greystone Hall before the letter arrived. Elinor had begun to settle into a cautious rhythm. Her feet were healing, though they were still tender. The bruise on her face had deepened to a mottled purple-green that Mrs. Beckett assured her would fade in time. She spent her mornings in the Rose Room, reading from the shelf of books that had clearly been placed there for her. In the afternoons, she sat in the small parlor overlooking the gardens, working on embroidery that Mrs. Beckett had kindly provided. The Duke she saw only at dinner. He was unfailingly polite, asking after her health and comfort but never pressing for conversation she was not ready to give. He spoke little of himself. Elinor learned only that he had inherited the dukedom young, that he had never married, and that he spent most of his time managing his estates and investments. There was a loneliness to him that she recognized, a distance he kept from the world that felt deliberate. She did not ask about the person he had mentioned, the one he had failed to help. He did not ask about the Baron. They maintained a careful peace, two wounded people sharing space without demanding more than the other could give. On the fourth morning, everything changed. Elinor was in the library running her fingers along the spines of leather-bound volumes when she heard raised voices from the front hall. She froze. One voice was Thomas, the Duke's valet. The other was unfamiliar, clipped, officious, demanding entry. I have business with His Grace on a matter of law, the stranger's voice carried clearly. You will inform him immediately that Mr. Wickham of Wickham and Sons, solicitors, is here on behalf of Baron Hartley. Elinor's blood turned to ice. She heard the Duke's voice then, calm and cold. Show him to my study, Thomas. Miss Ashford, please remain where you are. But Elinor had already moved away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Baron had found her. Of course he had. A young woman arriving at a duke's estate in the middle of the night would not go unnoticed by servants, and servants talked. The whole county would know by now. She pressed her back against the bookshelf, trying to steady her breathing. Through the partially open library door, she could hear footsteps moving down the hall toward the Duke's study. Then the sharp click of a door closing. Elinor did not know how long she stood there, frozen and listening. It could have been minutes or hours. Finally, she heard the study door open again, and the solicitor's voice, louder now and edged with frustration. His Grace will regret this decision. Baron Hartley is a respected man with powerful friends. He will not take this insult lightly. Then he should not have committed the actions that necessitated it. The Duke's voice was ice. Good day, Mr. Wickham. Thomas will show you out. More footsteps, the front door opening and closing, then silence. Elinor waited, her hands clenched so tightly that her bandaged palms ached. She knew she should go to her room, should pretend she had heard nothing. But before she could move, the Duke appeared in the library doorway. His expression was carefully controlled, but there was anger beneath it, the kind of cold, lethal anger that did not shout or storm but calculated and planned. I apologize for the disturbance, he said quietly. I had hoped to spare you this. What did he want? Elinor's voice came out steadier than she felt. The Duke hesitated, then crossed to the fire and stood with his back to her, staring into the flames. The Baron has filed a formal complaint with the magistrate. He claims that you stole from him jewelry, money, various valuables before fleeing his household. He is demanding your immediate return to face charges. The room tilted. Elinor gripped the back of a nearby chair to keep from falling. That's a lie. I took nothing. He made certain of that. He said I could take nothing that he had given me. I know. You believe me. The Duke turned to face her, and the intensity in his gray eyes nearly undid her. "I saw you on that road, Miss Ashford. I saw what you were wearing, how you had been treated. A thief does not run into a frozen night wearing evening slippers and torn silk. A thief takes coin, warm clothes, something practical. You had nothing, not even a cloak." His jaw tightened. "I told Mr. Wickham exactly that, along with several other observations that made him deeply uncomfortable." Eleanor's legs gave out, and she sank into the chair she had been gripping. "He'll have witnesses. The Baron always has witnesses, people who will say whatever he needs them to say. Then we will find witnesses who tell the truth." "There are no witnesses to the truth, Your Grace. Everyone who saw what happened that night saw only what the Baron wanted them to see, an ungrateful ward who refused a generous proposal and was asked to leave. They did not see him strike me, or if they did, they have chosen to forget." The Duke crossed the room and crouched in front of her chair, bringing himself to eye level. It was a strange, intimate gesture from a man who maintained such careful distance. "Listen to me carefully, Miss Ashford. The Baron is attempting to use the law to force you back into his control. That will not happen. I have already sent word to my own solicitor in London, a man who has never lost a case involving the protection of women from fraudulent claims. We will fight this." "You don't understand." Eleanor's voice broke despite her best efforts. "The Baron is not just making accusations, he is destroying my reputation. Even if I am never convicted of theft, the accusation alone will follow me everywhere. No decent household will employ me. No family will take me in. I will be ruined regardless of the truth." "Then let them ruin your reputation." The Duke's voice was fierce. "Reputation is a currency controlled by cowards and hypocrites. I care nothing for it, and neither should you. What matters is the truth and your freedom and your safety. Everything else is smoke." Eleanor stared at him. She had never heard anyone speak of reputation with such contempt, especially not a duke. Reputation was everything. It was the only thing that stood between a woman and complete social annihilation. "You can afford not to care about reputation, Your Grace," she said quietly. "You are a duke. I am a penniless ward accused of theft. We do not live in the same world." The Duke's expression softened slightly. "You are right, I apologize, that was thoughtless." He stood and moved back to the fire, giving her space. "But my point remains. I will not allow you to be dragged back to that man based on lies. Whatever the Baron thinks he can accomplish with this legal maneuvering, he will fail." What did the solicitor say, exactly? Eleanor needed to know the full extent of the danger. The Duke was silent for a moment, and Eleanor knew he was deciding whether to tell her the whole truth or spare her feelings. She appreciated that he chose the truth. "The Baron has submitted a formal complaint to the magistrate claiming you stole a diamond necklace, a ruby bracelet, and £200 in cash from his study. He has 3 witnesses prepared to testify that they saw you with these items. The magistrate has issued a warrant for your questioning." £200, a fortune, enough to hang for if the Baron pushed hard enough and found the right judge. Eleanor's hands began to shake. "I never even entered his study, and the only jewelry I have is my mother's ring." She held up her hand, showing the simple emerald band. "This has been on my finger since she died. It is the only thing of value I have ever possessed, and the Baron knew it. He tried to take it from me once, said I should sell it to contribute to the household expenses. I refused." The Duke's gaze fixed on the ring. "Did anyone witness that conversation?" "His housekeeper, Mrs. Price, but she would never testify against him. No one who depends on the Baron for their livelihood would dare." "Then we will find those who no longer depend on him, former servants, tradespeople he has cheated, others he has wronged." The Duke turned back to her. "Men like Baron Hartley leave trails of damage behind them. We need only follow it." "And if we find nothing?" Eleanor asked. "If everyone is too frightened to speak?" "Then I will stand as your witness," the Duke said simply. "I will testify to the condition in which I found you. I will testify that you had nothing in your possession save the clothes you wore and the ring on your finger. My word carries weight, Miss Ashford, more weight than the Baron's." Eleanor wanted to believe him, but she had learned in the Baron's household that the word of powerful men could be wielded like weapons, for protection or for harm, depending on their mood and interests. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You could simply turn me over. Or to the magistrate, it would be simpler. It would not bring the Baron's anger down on your house." The Duke was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough with something that sounded like old grief. I told you that I once failed someone who needed my help. I did not tell you that she died because of that failure, that she begged me to protect her from a man who claimed to love her, and I told her she was imagining dangers that did not exist. I told her to be reasonable, to be patient, to give him another chance. He paused, and Alina saw his hands clench at his sides. 2 months later, she was dead. The inquest called it an accident. I knew better, but I could not prove it, and I did not try hard enough. I was young and foolish and believed that justice would arrive on its own without my intervention. He looked directly at Alina. I will not make that mistake again. The Baron will not have you, Miss Ashford, not while I draw breath. The fierce certainty in his voice made Alina's chest ache. She saw, for the first time, the depth of the guilt he carried, saw that his kindness to her was not charity but penance, a debt he was trying to repay to a ghost. I am not her, your grace, Alina said gently. You do not owe me her life. No, the Duke agreed, but I owe you the truth and the protection I can give. That will have to be enough. Before Alina could respond, there was a sharp knock at the library door. Mrs. Beckett entered, her face pale and troubled. Your Grace, I apologize for the interruption, but there are 2 men from the magistrate's office at the front door. They say they have orders to question Miss Ashford immediately. She glanced at Alina with barely concealed worry. They have brought constables with them. The Duke's expression went utterly still. Then he turned to Alina and said very quietly, Do you trust me? Alina did not hesitate. Yes. Then go upstairs to your room and lock the door. Do not open it for anyone except Mrs. Beckett or myself. Do you understand? Your Grace. Do you understand? Alina nodded. Good, Mrs. Beckett, take her up the servants' stair, quickly and quietly. The Duke straightened his cuffs and adjusted his coat, and Alina watched as he transformed before her eyes into something cold and aristocratic and utterly formidable. I will deal with the magistrate's men. Mrs. Beckett took Alina's arm and guided her swiftly from the library. As they climbed the narrow back staircase, Alina heard the Duke's voice from the front hall, calm, cutting, laced with a disdain that could freeze water. Gentlemen, I am afraid you have wasted your time. Miss Ashford is a guest in my home and is not receiving visitors today, or any day for that matter, until I am satisfied that she will be treated with the respect she deserves. You may inform the magistrate that any further inquiries can be directed to my solicitor in London. Good day. Alina reached her room and locked the door as instructed. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening to the muffled sounds of argument from below. She could not make out the words, but she heard the Duke's voice, steady, immovable, aristocratic authority wielded like a blade. Eventually she heard the front door close, footsteps on the gravel drive, horses departing. Silence. Alina sank onto the edge of the bed, her whole body trembling. The Baron had made his move, and it was more dangerous than she had feared. He was not merely trying to destroy her reputation. He was trying to have her arrested, tried, and possibly hanged. And the only thing standing between her and that fate was a Duke she barely knew, carrying guilt for a woman he had failed to save. Alina closed her eyes and felt the emerald ring press into her palm. Her mother had worn this ring through poverty and illness and every hardship that came before her death. She had never taken it off, not even at the end. Dignity, her mother had whispered in those final days. Whatever they take from you, Alina, they cannot take that, not unless you give it to them. Alina had not given the Baron her dignity. She would not give it to the magistrate or to the law or to anyone else who demanded her surrender. But she was beginning to understand that dignity alone might not be enough to save her. She would need something more, something she had never possessed before. She would need someone willing to fight for her, not just out of guilt or duty, but because her life mattered. And against all probability, she had found exactly that in a cold Duke with gray eyes and a conscience that would not let him look away. The Duke's solicitor arrived from London 2 days later. Mr. Edmund Blackwell was a thin, sharp-eyed man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime in courtrooms. He listened to Alina's account of events with the same careful attention a physician might give to symptoms of dis-ease, noting details, asking precise questions, revealing nothing of his own thoughts. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Miss Ashford," he said finally, "I will be frank with you. Your situation is grave. Baron Hartley has prepared his case well. He has 3 witnesses who will swear under oath that they saw you in possession of the stolen items. He has documented the value of the items in question with receipts and appraisals, and he has positioned himself as a benevolent guardian cruelly betrayed by an ungrateful ward." Alina's hands tightened in her lap, but it is all lies. "The law does not always distinguish between lies told well and truth told poorly," Blackwell said, not unkindly. "What we need is evidence. Witnesses who can contradict his account. Documentation that proves you could not have been where he claims you were. Something tangible that breaks his narrative." "I have nothing," Alina said quietly. "I have my word and the ring on my finger and nothing else." Blackwell glanced at the Duke, who stood by the window with his arms crossed, his expression darker than Alina had yet seen it. "There must be someone," the Duke said. "A servant who knows the truth, a tradesperson who witnessed the Baron's character, someone." "I have sent inquiries to every former member of the Baron's household staff I could locate," Blackwell replied. "Most will not speak to me at all. Those who will say only that the Baron was a fair employer and Miss Ashford was treated generously. They are either lying or too frightened to tell the truth." "Then we go to the hearing and I testify on her behalf," the Duke said flatly. "I will describe the condition in which I found her. That alone should." "It will not be enough, Your Grace." Blackwell's voice was gentle but firm. "The Baron's solicitor will argue that Miss Ashford hid the stolen items before fleeing, or that she discarded them along the road. Your testimony proves only that she had nothing when you found her, not that she did not steal. Without a witness to the actual events in the Baron's household, we have nothing to counter his claims." The Duke's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. He knew Blackwell was right. Alina felt something cold settle in her chest. She had known, in some distant part of her mind, that this moment would come. That truth without proof was just another kind of powerlessness. But hearing it stated so plainly, by a man whose profession was the navigation of law and evidence, made it real in a way it had not been before. "What happens at the hearing?" she asked. Blackwell hesitated, and Alina knew the answer would not be kind. "The magistrate will hear the Baron's complaint and examine his evidence. He will question you under oath. If he finds the Baron's case credible, he will refer the matter to the assizes for trial. At trial, a jury will decide your guilt or innocence based on the evidence presented." He paused. "I will not mislead you, Miss Ashford. Juries are unpredictable, but they tend to favor men of property and standing over young women of no means, especially when the accusation involves theft of significant value. And if I am convicted—" "Transportation," Blackwell said quietly. 7 years minimum, possibly more, to Australia most likely." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. 7 years in a prison colony, half a world away among criminals and desperates. Alina had heard stories of the transport ships' disease, starvation, brutality. Many did not survive the voyage. Those who did rarely returned. "There must be something we can do," the Duke said, his voice rough. "Some legal mechanism, some—" "There is one option, Your Grace." Blackwell's tone was carefully neutral. "If Miss Ashford were to marry before the hearing, her legal status would change. As a married woman, she would fall under her husband's protection and authority. The Baron would lose his standing as her guardian, and his claim to her property or person would be nullified. The theft charges would become significantly more difficult to pursue." The silence that followed was absolute. Alina felt her face burn. She understood immediately what Blackwell was suggesting, and the humiliation of it was almost worse than the fear. She could not ask the Duke to marry her. The very thought was unbearable. He had shown her kindness, yes, but marriage was not kindness. It was a legal bond, a lifelong commitment. She would not trap him into such a thing to save herself. "No," she said before the Duke could speak. "Absolutely not. I will not. I will face the hearing. I will tell the truth. Perhaps the magistrate will see." "The magistrate is Baron Hartley's second cousin," Blackwell interrupted gently. "I should have mentioned that earlier. I apologize." Alina's breath caught. Of course. Of course the Baron would have ensured that every piece was positioned in his favor before making his move. He was not a stupid M. And he was a careful one. The Duke turned from the window, and Alina saw something in his expression that frightened her. Not anger now, but a kind of terrible resolve. "Blackwell," he said quietly, "leave us. I need to speak with Miss Ashford alone." The solicitor gathered his papers and left without argument. The door clicked shut, and Alina was alone with the Duke in the study that had become, in the past week, a place where her entire future was being decided by forces beyond her control. "Your Grace," she began. "I cannot let this happen," the Duke said, cutting her off. "I cannot stand by and watch you be convicted of crimes you did not commit. I cannot watch you be transported or worse. I will not." "You have done everything you can," Alina said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "More than anyone else would have done, but I will not ask you to sacrifice your freedom for mine. Marriage is not a solution. It is simply a different kind of prison." The Duke crossed to her and for the second time since they had met, crouched so they were eye to eye. His gray gaze was intense, almost fierce. "What if I wanted to offer it?" he asked quietly. "Not as a sacrifice, not as charity, but as a choice I make freely for reasons that have nothing to do with guilt or obligation." Alina's heart stuttered. "You do not know me, you do not owe me this." "I know enough," the Duke said. "I know you are brave enough to refuse a man you did not love, even when it cost you everything. I know you are strong enough to walk 4 miles in a frozen night rather than beg for mercy you should not have needed to ask for. I know you are honest enough to tell the truth even when lies would serve you better. That is more than most people reveal in a lifetime, Miss Ashford. It is enough." Tears burned in Alina's eyes. "You deserve more than a wife you married out of pity." "And you deserve more than a husband you married out of desperation," the Duke replied. "But we rarely get what we deserve in this life. We get what we choose and what we fight for. I am choosing this. The question is, will you?" Alina wanted to say no, wanted to refuse on principle, to protect him from a decision he might regret, to preserve what little dignity she had left. But the truth was simpler and more terrible than pride. If she refused, she would be convicted. She would be transported. She would disappear into a penal colony on the other side of the world and never return. And the Baron would win. Alina's voice broke. "I need time to think." The Duke nodded and stood, giving her space. "You have until tomorrow morning. The hearing is in 3 days. If we are to marry, it must be done quickly and legally with proper documentation. Blackwell can arrange it." He moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it is worth, Miss Ashford, I do not offer this lightly, and I do not expect anything from you beyond what you are willing to give. If you accept, you will have your own chambers, your own independence, and my protection for as long as you need it. Nothing more unless you wish it." Then he was gone, and Alina was alone with a decision that felt impossible. She sat in the study for a long time, watching the fire burn low. The emerald ring on her finger caught the light, and she thought of her mother, of the marriage her mother had made for love, and how little that love had protected her when poverty and illness came. Dignity, her mother had said, but dignity did not pay debts, it did not feed children, and it certainly did not fight legal battles against men with power and money and cousins in positions of authority. Alina closed her eyes and tried to imagine 7 years in Australia, tried to imagine surviving it, tried to imagine coming back, if she came back at all, and finding any kind of life worth living. She could not. The door opened and Alina looked up, expecting the Duke, but it was Mrs. Beckett who entered, carrying a tea tray. "I thought you might need this, miss," the housekeeper said kindly. She set the tray down and then, instead of leaving, took the chair across from Alina. "May I speak plainly?" Alina nodded, too exhausted to do anything else. "I have worked for His Grace for 15 years, Mrs. Beckett said. I watched him inherit this estate when he was barely 25. I watched him close himself off from the world after Lady Catherine died. That is the woman he told you about, his sister. She married a man who seemed charming, and His Grace tried to warn her, but she would not listen. When she died, His Grace blamed himself. He has blamed himself every day since." Alina's throat tightened. "A sister, not a lover, but a sister." "He has not been cruel in his grief," Mrs. Beckett continued. "But he has been alone. He has kept everyone at a distance, convinced that caring for anyone is simply inviting another failure. And then you arrived, bleeding and half frozen, and I saw something in his eyes I have not seen in 10 years. "What?" Alina whispered. "Purpose," Mrs. Beckett said simply. He is not offering to marry you out of pity, Miss Ashford. He is offering because you have reminded him what it feels like to fight for something that matters, to protect someone who deserves protecting. You have given him a reason to care again, and that is no small thing. But I do not love him, I barely know him. Love can grow, miss. I have seen it happen in the most unlikely places, but respect, honor, shared purpose, those are foundations strong enough to build a life on. His grace is offering you those things. The question is whether you are brave enough to accept them. Mrs. Beckett stood and moved toward the door. Whatever you decide, know this, you are not a burden, you are not an imposition. You are a woman who deserves safety and freedom and a future. Do not let the Baron's lies convince you otherwise. Then she was gone, and Alina was alone again. She sat there until the fire died to embers, turning the decision over and over in her mind. Every argument against accepting the Duke's proposal was rooted in pride, in the fear of being a burden, of trapping him, of losing what little independence she had left. But every argument for accepting was rooted in something more fundamental. Survival. When the first light of dawn crept through the study windows, Alina finally rose. Her decision was made. It was not the decision she would have chosen in a world where she had choices, but it was the decision that would let her live and fight and perhaps, someday, find a way to repay the man who had refused to look away when everyone else did. She found the Duke in the breakfast room, staring at a cup of tea he had not touched. "Yes," Alina said quietly from the doorway. The Duke looked up and something like relief crossed his face. "You are certain." "I am certain that I want to live," Alina said. "And I am certain that you are the only person who has cared enough to make that possible. If you are truly willing, Your Grace, then yes, I will marry you." The Duke stood and crossed to her. He took her hand, the one with the emerald ring, and held it gently. "Then we will face whatever comes next together," he said. "And the Baron will learn that some women cannot be broken, no matter how hard he tries." Alina nodded, and for the first time since the night the Baron struck her, she felt something that was not quite hope but was close enough to sustain her. She would survive this, and when it was over she would make certain that no one else suffered the way she had. That was a promise she made to herself, standing in the morning light with her hand in the Duke's. And it was a promise she intended to keep. If this story is pulling at something inside you, leave a comment, tell me. Would you have stayed silent like she did, or would you have fought back with words? Your answer matters. The marriage took place the following morning in the chapel at Greystone Hall. It was a brief, quiet ceremony with only Mr. Blackwell, Mrs. Beckett, and Thomas as witnesses. Alina wore the blue wool dress, the only proper dress she owned. The Duke wore dark gray, severe and formal. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration. Just words spoken before God and law, binding two people who had known each other less than 2 weeks. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, the Duke took Alina's hand and held it for a moment. His grip was warm and steady. Then he released her, and they signed the register in silence. Alina was now the Duchess of Ashworth. The title felt like armor she did not know how to wear. "The hearing is this afternoon," Blackwell said as they left the chapel. "The Baron will not be expecting this. We should arrive early and present the marriage certificate before he has time to adjust his strategy." The Duke nodded. "We leave within the hour." Alina had imagined this moment differently. In her mind, marriage, if it ever came, would be followed by relief, by safety, by the knowledge that the worst was over. Instead, she felt only a tight knot of dread in her stomach. The Baron would not accept this quietly. He would fight back with everything he had. And she still did not know what that might cost. The magistrate's court was held in a stone building in the center of the nearest market town, a place that smelled of old wood and older grievances. Alina had never been inside a courtroom before. The high ceiling and dark paneling made her feel small, exposed. The Duke walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back, a gesture of support that looked to anyone watching like possession. Alina understood the performance. In the eyes of the law, she was his property now. That was what marriage meant for women, but the Duke's touch was gentle and she drew what comfort she could from it. Baron Hartley was already seated near the front, flanked by his solicitor Mr. Wickham and 3 well-dressed Whitney. Says, when he saw Alina enter on the Duke's arm, his face went rigid with shock. then darkened with fury. "Your Grace," the Baron said, standing abruptly. His voice was tight, controlled. "How unexpected to see you here. I was not aware you had an interest in this matter." "Then you were not paying attention, Baron," the Duke replied coolly. "I have had an interest since the night I found Miss Ashford, pardon me, the Duchess of Ashworth, bleeding on a frozen road after you cast her out without so much as a cloak." The room went utterly silent. The Baron's solicitor rose quickly. "Your Grace, with respect, Miss Ashford's marriage does not negate the serious charges." "It negates your client standing to bring them," Blackwell interrupted smoothly, stepping forward. He produced a folded document from his coat. "The Duchess of Ashworth is no longer Baron Hartley's ward. She is the wife of a peer of the realm, and as such, any claims regarding property or theft must now be directed to her husband, who, I should note, was not present in the Baron's household and cannot possibly have stolen anything from it." Wickham's face flushed. The marriage is clearly a legal maneuver designed to evade justice. "The marriage is legal, properly witnessed and recorded," Blackwell said, handing the certificate to the magistrate, a portly man with thinning hair who looked deeply uncomfortable with the turn of events. "Which means these proceedings are based on a complaint filed against a woman who no longer exists in the legal sense. The charges must be dismissed." The magistrate examined the certificate with the expression of a man who wished he were anywhere else. "This is highly irregular." "What is irregular?" the Duke said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Is a man who proposes marriage to his ward in front of witnesses is refused, and then strikes her hard enough to split her lip and bruise her face. What is irregular is that same man casting a young woman into a November night without shelter or protection, hoping she would freeze to death before anyone found her. What is irregular is that man then filing false charges of theft to punish her for refusing him." "That is slander." The Baron was on his feet now, his face mottled red. "I offered that girl everything, a home, a future respectability she could never have achieved on her own, and she threw it back in my face with ingratitude and insolence." "You offered her a lifetime of being owned by a man she did not love," the Duke replied, his voice deadly calm. "She declined, that was her right. What you did afterward was not discipline or justice, it was cruelty." The Baron's hands clenched into fists. "You know nothing of what happened in my household, you were not there." "No," the Duke agreed. "But I was there when I found her. I saw the marks your hand left on her face. I saw her torn dress, her bleeding feet, her bare hands frozen so badly she could barely move her fingers. I saw what you did, Baron, and I will swear to it under oath if necessary." The magistrate cleared his throat nervously. "Your Grace, while your testimony is certainly compelling, the fact remains that Baron Hartley has brought 3 witnesses who claim to have seen the Duchess, then Miss Ashford, in possession of stolen property." "Then let us hear from these witnesses," Blackwell said. "Let them describe exactly what they saw when they saw it and under what circumstances." The first witness was called, a middle-aged woman in a plain gray dress who identified herself as Mrs. Price, the Baron's housekeeper. Eleanor's heart sank. Mrs. Price had worked for the Baron for 20 years. She would say whatever he needed her to say. "Mrs. Price," Wickham began, "please tell the court what you witnessed on the night of November 15th. Mrs. Price folded her hands in her lap. "I saw Miss Ashford in the Baron's study at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening. She was standing near the Baron's desk, and she appeared to be examining items from the safe." "What items?" Wickham asked. "A diamond necklace and a ruby bracelet. I saw them quite clearly." Eleanor's breath caught. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but Mrs. Price delivered it with such calm certainty that it sounded like truth. "And what did you do when you saw this?" Wickham continued. "I informed the Baron immediately, of course." "Thank you, Mrs. Price." Wickham sat down looking satisfied. Blackwell rose to cross-examine. "Mrs. Price, you say you saw Miss Ashford in the Baron's study at 9 o'clock. Where were you standing when you observed this?" Mrs. Price hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "In the hallway, outside the study door." "And the door was open?" "Partially." "How partially?" "A few inches, perhaps." Blackwell nodded. "A few inches. And through this gap of a few inches, in a room lit only by candles at 9 o'clock on a November evening, you clearly saw Miss Ashford examining a diamond." D necklace and ruby bracelet. Is that your testimony? Mrs. Price's confidence wavered. Yes. Mrs. Price, have you ever been in the Baron's study? Of course, I am the housekeeper. Then you know that the Baron's desk faces the window, not the door, which means that if Miss Ashford were standing at the desk, her back would have been to you. How, then, did you see what she was examining? Mrs. Price opened her mouth, closed it, then said weakly, She turned, I saw her turn. While holding stolen jewelry. She turned toward an open door while committing theft, and you saw her clearly enough to identify specific pieces. Yes. Blackwell let the answer hang in the air. Mrs. Price, how long have you worked for Baron Hartley? 23 years. And in those 23 years, has he ever dismissed a servant without references? Mrs. Price's face went pale. That is not relevant to. Has he? Blackwell pressed. Yes, Mrs. Price whispered, once or twice. What happened to those servants after they lost their positions without references? Wickham stood, objection. This is not relevant to the matter at hand. It is entirely relevant, Blackwell said sharply. It establishes whether the witness has reason to fear contradicting her employer. The magistrate looked pained. I will allow it. Answer the question, Mrs. Price. Mrs. Price's hands twisted in her lap. I do not know what happened to them. You do not know or you do not wish to say. Blackwell's voice was gentle now, almost kind. Mrs. Price, did Baron Hartley tell you what to say here today? The silence stretched unbearably long. He told me what he needed, Mrs. Price said finally, her voice barely audible. He said Miss Ashford had betrayed his trust and needed to face consequences. He said it was my duty to help him. Did he tell you that if you did not help him, you would lose your position? Another long silence, then so quietly that the magistrate had to ask her to repeat herself. Yes. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The Baron shot to his feet. This is absurd. I merely asked my housekeeper to tell the truth. You asked her to lie, the Duke said, his voice cutting through the noise. And you threatened her livelihood if she refused. That is coercion, Baron, not truth. The magistrate banged his gavel. Order, I will have order. He looked at Mrs. Price, who was now crying quietly. Mrs. Price, I ask you directly, did you actually see Miss Ashford in possession of stolen jewelry? Mrs. Price shook her head. No, sir, I saw her leaving the Baron's study, but she had nothing in her hands, nothing at all. The Baron told me what to say afterward. He said she had taken things and I needed to confirm it. The Baron's face went from red to white. You stupid woman. Enough, the magistrate's voice cracked like a whip. Baron Hartley, sit down now. The Baron sat, but his eyes were fixed on Alina with such hatred that she felt it like a physical blow. The Duke moved slightly, placing himself between Alina and the Baron's line of sight. The second witness was called, but he recanted almost immediately under Blackwell's questioning, admitting he had been in the Baron's employ and had been promised a generous sum for his testimony. The third witness did not even wait to be questioned. He stood and left the courtroom without a word. The magistrate removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. Mr. Wickham, does your client have any actual evidence to support these charges, or shall I dismiss them now and spare us all further embarrassment? Wickham looked at the Baron, who sat rigid and silent, his jaw clenched so tightly Alina could see the muscles jumping. We have no further evidence at this time, Wickham said stiffly. Then these charges are dismissed, the magistrate said. Furthermore, I am deeply troubled by the apparent coercion of witnesses and the filing of what appear to be entirely fraudulent complaints. Baron Hartley, you will remain here. I wish to speak with you privately about potential charges of perjury and witness intimidation. The Baron's face went ashen. Blackwell gathered his papers. Thank you, sir. Your Grace, we should take our leave. But the Duke did not move immediately. He walked slowly toward the Baron, who stood frozen beside his solicitor's table. When the Duke spoke, his voice was low enough that only those closest could hear. You wanted to destroy her, the Duke said. You wanted to see her broken, humiliated, transported to the other side of the world where no one would ever hear her name again, because she said no to you, because she had the audacity to refuse a man who thought he owned her. The Baron said nothing, but his hands shook. Let me be very clear about what happens now, the Duke continued. If you ever speak Aliner's name again, if you ever spread rumors about her character, if you ever attempt to contact her or come within a mile of any property I own, I will destroy you, not quickly, not cleanly. I will dismantle your life piece by piece. I will call in every debt you owe, expose every corner you have cut, ruin every business relationship you have cultivated. I will make certain that every person in this county knows exactly what kind of man you are. You cannot, the Baron started. I am a duke, the Duke said flatly. You are a baron whose fortune is built on loans and speculation. We both know which of us has more power. Test me if you wish. I welcome it. He turned and walked back to Alina, offering his arm. She took it, and together they left the courtroom. Outside, the November sun was bright and cold. Alina took a deep breath of clean air and felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since the night the Baron struck her. Is it over? She asked quietly. The legal matter is over, the Duke said. The magistrate will likely pursue charges against the Baron for witness tampering. Even if he does not, the scandal will follow the Baron for years. His reputation is ruined. And mine. The Duke looked down at her, and for the first time since they had met, she saw something that might have been the beginning of a smile at the corner of his mouth. You are a duchess now, he said. Your reputation is whatever you decide it to be. Alina wanted to believe that, wanted to believe that a title could protect her the way nothing else had. But she knew better. Titles were just words. What protected her was the man standing beside her, the man who had chosen to fight for her when he could have looked away. Thank you, she said, for everything, for stopping on that road, for believing me, for... Do not thank me, the Duke said quietly. You saved yourself, Alina. I merely made certain you had the chance to do so. They walked to the carriage in silence. Mrs. Beckett was waiting, and she smiled when she saw Alina's face. It went well then, the housekeeper asked. The charges are dismissed, Alina said, and the Baron will not trouble us again. Mrs. Beckett's smile widened. Good. That man deserved worse than a ruined reputation, but I suppose it will have to do. As the carriage rolled away from the courthouse, Alina looked back one last time. She could see the Baron standing in the doorway watching them leave. His face was no longer red with anger or white with shock. It was simply empty, the face of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him and was only now beginning to understand the full extent of his defeat. Alina felt no triumph, no joy, only a quiet, tired relief. She had survived. The truth had won, not because truth was inherently powerful, but because people, Mrs. Price, Mr. Blackwell, the Duke, had chosen to speak it and fight for it when it would have been easier to stay silent. The Baron had learned what happened when he underestimated a woman he thought he could control. And Alina had learned that dignity and silence could be weapons, when wielded by someone who refused to surrender them. She leaned back against the carriage seat and closed her eyes. The emerald ring on her finger, her mother's ring, caught the light. Whatever they take from you, her mother had said, they cannot take your dignity unless you give it to them. Alina had not given it, not to the Baron, not to anyone. And now, finally, she was free. The first week after the hearing passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Alina was a duchess now, at least in name. The reality of it felt distant, unreal. She wore the title the way she wore the fine dresses Mrs. Beckett had ordered for her, carefully, uncertainly, as though at any moment someone might realize the mistake and take them back. The Duke was kind but remote. He took his meals with her, asked after her comfort, ensured she had everything she needed. But there was a distance between them that had not existed before the marriage. Alina understood why. They had bound themselves together out of necessity, not affection. The intimacy of crisis had passed, and now they were simply two people who happened to share a name and a home. She told herself this was what she had expected, what she had agreed to. It did not make the loneliness easier to bear. On the 8th day, Alina made a decision. She found Mrs. Beckett in the still room, sorting through dried herbs. I need you to help me find a position, Alina said without preamble. Mrs. Beckett looked up, startled. A position, Your Grace. The title still sounded wrong in Alina's ears. I cannot stay here indefinitely. His Grace married me to save me from the Baron's charges, and he has done that. I am grateful beyond measure, but I will not be a burden to him for the rest of his life. I need employment, a governess position perhaps, or a companion to an elderly lady, something respectable that will allow me to support myself." Mrs. Beckett set down the lavender she had been holding. "Yo. Grace, you are the Duchess of Ashworth. You do not need employment." "I need purpose," Alina corrected. "I need to be something other than a woman who was rescued and then set on a shelf like a piece of charity work completed." "Have you spoken to His Grace about this?" Alina's hands twisted together. "No, and I will not. He has done enough for me. I will not ask him for permission to leave." Mrs. Beckett was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very gently, "Your Grace, I have known His Grace for 15 years. I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Alina's breath caught. "He looks at me with pity, with responsibility, that is not." "He looks at you," Mrs. Beckett interrupted, "the way a man looks at someone who has become essential to his happiness without his quite realizing when it happened. And you, if you will forgive me for saying so, look at him the same way." Alina felt heat rise in her cheeks. "That is not true. We barely know each other. We married out of necessity, not." "Love can begin in necessity," Mrs. Beckett said quietly. "I have seen it happen, but it cannot grow if one person is planning her escape before giving it a chance to take root." Alina had no answer to that. She left the stillroom and walked through the gardens, trying to calm the confusion in her chest. The November air was cold and sharp, but the gardens at Greystone were beautiful even in late autumn, bare trees and frost-touched grass and the skeletal remains of summer roses. She found herself at a stone bench near the edge of the formal garden, overlooking the moor. This was where she had sat several times in the past week, trying to make sense of her new life, trying to understand what she was supposed to do with freedom that came wrapped in obligation. "I thought I might find you here." Alina turned. The Duke stood a few feet away, his hands in his coat pockets, his expression unreadable. He looked tired, she realized. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there a week ago. "I apologize," Alina said, standing quickly. "I did not mean to monopolize this spot. I can." "Sit," the Duke said quietly, "please." Alina sat. The Duke joined her on the bench, leaving a careful space between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. "Mrs. Beckett tells me you are seeking employment," the Duke said finally. Alina closed her eyes. Of course Mrs. Beckett had told him. "I am, yes." "May I ask why?" "Because I cannot stay here as your dependent forever, Your Grace. You have given me safety and protection and a name that shields me from the Baron and anyone else who might wish me harm. I am more grateful than I can express, but I need," her voice caught. "I need to be more than someone you saved. I need to have a life of my own." The Duke was silent for so long that Alina thought he might simply agree and let her go. Then he said, very quietly, "What if I asked you to stay?" Alina's heart stuttered. "You do not need to ask. This is your home. I will stay as long as you require." "That is not what I meant." The Duke turned to face her fully. "What if I asked you to stay not because I require it, but because I want it? Because the thought of you leaving, of this house being empty again, of taking meals alone and walking these gardens alone and going back to the life I had before you arrived. What if I told you I do not want that?" Alina stared at him. "Your Grace." "Alexander," he said. "My name is Alexander, and I would very much like it if you would use it." "Alexander." The name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her chest ache. "You do not owe me anything. You have already given me everything." "I have given you protection," Alexander said. "I have given you my name and my home, but I have not given you the one thing I should have offered from the beginning." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with something that sounded like vulnerability. "The truth." Alina's hands tightened in her lap. "What truth?" Alexander looked away, out over the moor. "When Catherine died, I told myself I would never care for anyone again. It was easier that way, safer. If I did not love, I could not fail. If I did not let anyone close, I could not lose them." He drew a breath. "And then I found you on that road, bleeding and frozen and still fighting to survive, and something in me, something I thought had died with Catherine, woke up." Alina's throat tightened. "You were so fierce," Alexander continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Even half-conscious, even broken and betrayed, you would not surrender. You would not beg, you would not break. And I realized that I had spent 10 years trying not to care about anything, and in one night I had found someone worth caring about whether I wanted to or not. Alexander, let me finish, he said quietly, please. Alina nodded, unable to speak. I told myself I was helping you out of guilt, out of obligation to Catherine's memory, out of a desire to do the right thing, and all of that was true, but it was not the whole truth. He turned back to her, and the raw honesty in his eyes nearly undid her. The whole truth is that somewhere between finding you on that road and standing beside you in that courtroom, I stopped seeing you as someone to be saved and started seeing you as someone I wanted in my life, not as a duty, not as penance, but as a choice I made because the alternative, a life without you, had become unthinkable. Alina's vision blurred. You do not know me well enough to. I know you refused a man you did not love even when it cost you everything, Alexander said. I know you walked 4 miles in a frozen night rather than compromise your dignity. I know you chose to marry a stranger rather than let a liar destroy you with false testimony. I know you are brave and stubborn and honest and strong, and I know that every day you have been in this house, it has felt more like a home than it has in a decade. A tear slipped down Alina's cheek. I am not brave, I was terrified, I am still terrified. Bravery is not the absence of fear, Alexander said gently. It is choosing to act despite it. You have done that every day since the night the Baron struck you. You are the bravest person I have ever known. Alina shook her head, unable to accept the weight of his words. I was going to ask Mrs. Beckett to help me find employment because I thought you regretted marrying me. I thought you looked at me and saw only an obligation you were too honorable to abandon. And I thought you looked at me and saw only the man who had trapped you into a marriage you did not want, Alexander said. I thought you were planning your escape the moment you no longer needed my protection. They stared at each other, and Alina felt something shift between them. A recognition that they had both been wrong, both been afraid, both been too caught up in their own fears to see what was directly in front of them. I do not regret marrying you, Alexander said quietly. I regret only that I could not offer you a choice made in freedom rather than desperation. I regret that our marriage began as a legal strategy rather than a mutual desire. But I do not regret you, Alina. I could never regret you. Alina's hand moved of its own accord, reaching across the space between them to rest on his. Alexander looked down at their joined hands, and Alina saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. I do not know how to be a duchess, Alina said, her voice shaking. I do not know how to navigate society or host dinners or do any of the things a woman in my position is supposed to know. I am a penniless ward who can embroider and read Latin and nothing else of use. You know how to survive, Alexander said. You know how to stand up for what is right. You know how to refuse what you do not want and fight for what you do. That is worth more than every social grace in the world. And you, Alina asked, what do you know? Alexander's lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. I know how to be cold, how to keep the world at a distance, how to manage an estate and make profitable investments and do everything except the one thing that matters. Which is? Let someone in, Alexander said quietly. Trust someone enough to show them the parts of myself I have kept locked away for a decade. Risk caring about someone even though I might lose them. Alina turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. And if I stayed, if I chose to stay not because I had nowhere else to go but because I wanted to see what this could become, what we could become, would you let me in? Alexander's grip tightened, yes. Even knowing that I do not love you yet. Yet, Alexander repeated, and there was something like hope in his voice. You said yet. Alina felt a smile tug at the corner of her mouth despite the tears on her cheeks. I did I not? Love can grow, Alexander said, echoing words Alina had heard before. If we give it time and space and honesty, if we choose each other every day not out of obligation but out of genuine desire to build something together. That sounds terrifying, Alina whispered. It is, Alexander agreed, but I would rather be terrified with you than safe and alone without you. Alina looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the cold, severe duke who had found her on a frozen road, but a man who had been wounded and lonely and afraid of caring too much. a man who had chosen to care anyway despite the risk. "I want to stay," Alina said quietly. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, not because I owe you anything, but because when I imagine leaving, when I imagine being anywhere but here with you, I cannot bear it." Alexander released a breath that sounded like he had been holding it for days. "Then stay, build a life here, make this house yours, make me," he paused in WH. And he continued, his voice was raw, "make me yours if you will have me." Alina raised her free hand to his face, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "I am already yours," she said. "I think I have been since the moment you wrapped that blanket around me and promised I was safe. I just did not know how to say it." Alexander turned his head and pressed a kiss to her palm, gentle, reverent, achingly tender. "Then we will learn together how to say it, how to trust it, how to build something that neither of us has had before." "What is that?" Alina asked. "A home," Alexander said simply. "Not just a house, but a home, a place where we both belong." Alina leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. They sat like that for a long moment, breathing in sync, two people who had found each other in the worst possible circumstances and chosen to make something beautiful from the wreckage. "I am still frightened," Alina whispered. "So am I," Alexander admitted, "but I would rather face that fear with you than hide from it alone." Alina pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "Then we face it together." "Together," Alexander agreed. And there, on a stone bench overlooking the moor where Alina had once walked alone and broken, they made a new promise to each other. Not the promise spoken in a chapel before witnesses, but a quieter, more honest promise. To choose each other, to build a life together, to let love grow in the space between necessity and desire. It was not the ending Alina had imagined when she fled the Baron's house. It was not the fairy tale she had read about in books. It was something better. It was real. Spring came to Greystone Hall with a gentleness that Alina had not known the world could possess. The gardens that had been skeletal and frost-touched when she first arrived now burst with color, daffodils and tulips and early roses climbing the stone walls. The moor, which had seemed so desolate and threatening that November night, now rolled green and gold under a sky that was more blue than gray. Everything that had been frozen had thawed. Everything that had seemed dead had come back to life. Alina stood in the rose garden, her hands working soil around a new planting. Her fingers were dirty, her day dress practical and plain, her hair pulled back in a simple knot. She looked nothing like a duchess was supposed to look, and she did not care. 6 months had passed since the hearing. 6 months since she had become Alina Ashford, Duchess of Ashworth, in truth as well as name. The transition had not been easy. There had been awkward dinners with neighboring families who did not know what to make of the Duke's sudden marriage. There had been whispered rumors about the circumstances of their meeting, speculation about whether the marriage was real or merely a legal convenience. There had been moments when Alina felt the weight of the title like a stone around her neck, moments when she wondered if she would ever truly belong in this world. But there had also been mornings like this one, quiet, peaceful, spent doing work she chose rather than work assigned to her. There had been evenings by the fire with Alexander, reading companionably or discussing estate business or simply sitting in silence that was comfortable rather than strained. There had been small moments of connection, his hand on her shoulder as he passed, her smile when he made a dry observation about a pompous neighbor, the way they had learned to read each other's moods without words. Love had grown slowly, carefully, like the roses Alina was tending. Not the passionate, consuming love of novels, but something steadier, something that felt like coming home. "You are going to ruin that dress," Alexander said from behind her. Alina turned and smiled. He stood at the edge of the garden, dressed for riding, his hair slightly disheveled from the wind. He looked younger than he had that first night. The shadows under his eyes had faded, the severity in his expression had softened. He looked, Alina thought, like a man who had remembered how to be happy. "It is already ruined," Alina said, gesturing to the mud stains on her hem. "Mrs. Beckett despairs of me." "Mrs. Beckett adores you," Alexander corrected, crossing to where she knelt. "She told me yesterday that you have brought more life to this house in 6 months than it has seen in 15 years. Alina felt warmth bloom in her chest. "She is kind. She is honest." Alexander crouched beside her, examining the roses she was planting. Are these the cuttings from the old garden? Yes, I thought. Elinor hesitated, then continued. I thought it would be fitting to bring something back that had been forgotten, to give it new life. Alexander was quiet for a moment, and Elinor knew he understood what she was really saying. This was not just about roses. This was about second chances, about taking things that had been damaged or abandoned and they could bloom again. They will be beautiful, Alexander said quietly. Elinor looked at him, at the man who had stopped on a frozen road when no one else would. The man who had fought for her when she had no one else to fight for her. The man who had given her not just protection but partnership. Yes, she agreed, they will be. They worked together for a while in comfortable silence, planting roses and clearing weeds. When they finished, Elinor's hands were thoroughly dirty and her dress was beyond saving, but she felt more satisfied than she had felt doing any of the fine embroidery or elegant tasks that ladies were supposed to prefer. There is something I need to tell you, Alexander said as they walked back toward the house. Elinor's stomach tightened with instinctive worry. What is it? I received a letter this morning from the magistrate. Alexander's expression was carefully neutral. The Baron has left the county, quietly in the middle of the night with debts unpaid and legal proceedings unfinished. It appears he has fled to the continent. Elinor stopped walking. He is gone. Gone, Alexander confirmed. The magistrate's investigation revealed that the Baron had been defrauding creditors for years, falsifying accounts, borrowing against property he did not own. The charges you faced were only the beginning. Once people started looking closely at his affairs, everything unraveled. Elinor thought of the Baron, his rage, his certainty that he was untouchable, his conviction that he could bend the world to his will through lies and intimidation. And now he was gone, fled like a common criminal, his reputation destroyed, his power stripped away. She waited for satisfaction, for triumph, for the fierce joy of seeing an enemy defeated. Instead, she felt only a quiet, tired relief. I am glad it is over, she said finally. Are you? Alexander asked, watching her carefully. You do not seem pleased. I am not pleased, Elinor said slowly, trying to find the right words. But I am not sad either. I do not want him to suffer. I just wanted him to stop, to leave me alone, to face consequences for what he did, and now he has. She paused. That is enough. Alexander took her hand, the one with the emerald ring still on her finger after all these months. You are a better person than I am. If someone had hurt you the way he did, I would want more than consequences. I would want destruction. Elinor smiled faintly. You wanted to destroy his estate, as I recall. I still do, Alexander admitted. But you are right, justice does not require vengeance, it only requires truth. They walked on, hand in hand, back toward the house that had become Elinor's home. As they reached the entrance, Elinor paused and looked back at the gardens, at the roses they had planted together, at the moor beyond, at the road that wound away into the distance. Somewhere out there, miles away, was the spot where Alexander had found her. The place where her old life had ended and this new one had begun. She thought of the girl she had been that night, bleeding, frozen, silent in her dignity because silence was all she had left. She thought of how close she had come to dying on that road, how easily she could have been forgotten, how simple it would have been for the world to move on without her. But she had not died, she had survived, and in surviving she had found something she had not known she was looking for. Not just safety, not just protection, but a partner who saw her as more than a problem to be solved or a charity case to be managed. Someone who had given her space to heal and time to grow and the freedom to choose her own path even when that path included him. What are you thinking about? Alexander asked. Elinor turned back to him. I am thinking about silence, she said. About how everyone assumed my silence that night meant weakness or shame, but it was neither of those things. What was it? Alexander asked quietly. Dignity, Elinor said. It was the only thing I had left and I would not give it to them, not to the Baron, not to his guests, not to anyone, she paused. But I have learned something since then. What is that? Silence is powerful, Elinor said slowly. But it should be a choice, not a necessity. I stayed silent that night because speaking would have accomplished nothing. The Baron's guests had already made their choice to look away. But I should not have to be silent forever. I should not have to accept injustice quietly just because I am a woman, or because I have no power, or because speaking might make people uncomfortable. Alexander's expression grew fierce. You will never have to be silent again. Not in this house, not with me. Whatever you need to say, whatever you need to fight for, I will stand with you. Alina felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. I know, she said. That is why I can choose when to speak and when to stay silent. Because. Yes, I know I have that choice now. You gave me that. You gave it to yourself, Alexander corrected gently. I merely made certain you survived long enough to claim it. They stood together in the doorway, neither quite ready to go inside. The spring sun was warm on Alina's face, and she realized that for the first time in her life she felt truly safe. Not the fragile safety of being useful to someone or the conditional safety of being obedient, but the deep, unshakable safety of being valued for who she was, not what she could provide. Do you remember what you said to me that first day in the library? Alina asked. When I told you I did not want to cause trouble. I said the trouble had already been caused, Alexander replied, not by you. I did not believe you then, Alina admitted. I had spent so long being told that everything was my fault, my father's debts, the Baron's anger, the inconvenience of my existence. I thought if I could just be smaller, quieter, more grateful, then eventually I would stop being a problem. And now I know that I was never the problem, Alina said firmly. The Baron was the problem. The guests who watched him strike me and did nothing were the problem. The system that gave him power over me and then blamed me for not being grateful for his abuse, that was the problem. She looked up at Alexander. I was just a woman trying to survive with her dignity intact. That was never wrong. Alexander raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. No, it was never wrong. They went inside together, and Alina found Mrs. Beckett waiting with news that the Dowager Countess of Pemberton had called and left an invitation to tea. The Countess was a formidable woman who held significant social influence in the county. An invitation from her meant acceptance, recognition, the beginning of Alina's real establishment as the Duchess of Ashworth. Will you accept? Alexander asked. Alina thought about it. 6 months ago she would have been terrified. She would have worried about saying the wrong thing, wearing the wrong dress, failing to meet the expectations of a woman like the Countess. She would have seen it as a test she might fail. Now she saw it for what it was, an opportunity. A chance to build connections, to establish herself, to create a life in this community that was hers by choice rather than by accident. Yes, Alina said, I will accept, but on one condition. What condition? Alexander asked, amused. That you come with me, Alina said. I am still learning how to be a duchess. I would prefer not to do it alone. You will never have to do anything alone again, Alexander promised. Not if you do not wish to. It was a promise he had kept every day since their marriage, and Alina believed he would keep it for every day to come. That evening they sat together in the library, the room where Alina had first really spoken to Alexander, where she had begun to understand that he was not just her rescuer but potentially something more. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Alina worked on her embroidery while Alexander read correspondence. It was a quiet, domestic scene, unremarkable to anyone who might have observed it, but to Alina it was everything. This was what freedom looked like. Not grand adventures or dramatic rescues, just the simple ability to sit in a warm room with someone she cared for, doing work she had chosen, without fear of sudden violence or arbitrary punishment. Alina, Alexander said, setting down his letter. She looked up, yes. I need you to know something. His expression was serious and Alina felt a flutter of concern. I have been thinking about what you said earlier, about silence being a choice rather than a necessity, about speaking when it matters. Yes. There is something I have not said to you, Alexander continued. Something I should have said weeks ago, but I was afraid. Afraid you would not believe me, or that you would think I was simply caught up in the drama of rescue and recovery. Alina set down her embroidery, her heart beginning to race. What is it? Alexander crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. The emerald ring caught the firelight, just as it had on that frozen road so many months ago. I love you, he said quietly. Not because I saved you or because I feel responsible for you or because we are bound by law. I love you because you are brave and stubborn and kind. Because you refuse to let the Baron break you. Because you plant roses and argue with me about estate management and make this house feel alive again. Because when I imagine my future, I cannot imagine it without you. Aliner's vision blurred with tears. Alexander. You do not have to say it back, he continued quickly. I am not asking for anything, I just needed you to know. I needed to stop being silent about the one thing that matters most. Aliner laughed, though it caught me out more like a sob. You foolish man, I have been trying to find the courage to say it for weeks. I love you too. I think I started loving you the moment you wrapped that blanket around me and promised I was safe, and I have been falling deeper every day since. Alexander's expression transformed, relief and joy and something that looked almost like wonder. He stood and pulled Alina to her feet, and then his arms were around her and she was pressed against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. We are both fools then, he murmured into her hair. Yes, Alina agreed, but at least we are fools together. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the firelight, two people who had found each other in the darkest circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage. Alina thought of the girl she had been 6 months ago, silent, broken, walking toward what she thought was certain death. And she thought of the woman she had become, a woman who had learned that silence could be strength, that dignity was worth fighting for, and that sometimes the people who seemed coldest on the outside were simply protecting hearts that had been hurt too many times. The truth, Alina had learned, did not always speak loudly. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it stayed silent and waited for someone brave enough to listen to what was not being said. And when someone finally listened, when someone powerful enough chose to care about truth more than convenience, everything could change. The Baron had tried to destroy her with lies. He had failed because one man on a frozen road had chosen to stop, to listen, to see what everyone else had decided to ignore. That was the difference between cruelty and kindness, between looking away and looking closer, between accepting the easy narrative and demanding the truth. Alina had not needed a voice that night on the road. She had needed someone willing to see that her silence was not consent, but dignity held onto with both hands. And she had found exactly that. Thank you, Alina whispered against Alexander's chest. For what? He asked. For listening, she said, for hearing what I could not say. Alexander's arms tightened around her. Always, he promised, for as long as we both live. And in the warm library of Greystone Hall, surrounded by books and firelight and the promise of spring outside, Alina Ashford, once a penniless ward, now a duchess, always a woman who refused to be broken, finally understood what it meant to be truly free. Not because someone had rescued her, though that had mattered. Not because the law had vindicated her, though that too had been essential. But because she had learned that her worth was not determined by those who tried to diminish her, that her silence could be strength, that her dignity was hers to keep or give, and no one could take it from her. The Baron had slapped her, cast her out, tried to destroy her with lies and legal manipulation. He had done everything in his power to break her spirit. He had failed. And Alina had won, not through violence or vengeance, but through the simple, radical act of refusing to surrender who she was. That was the lesson she would carry forward. That was the truth she would teach anyone who would listen. Dignity cannot be taken, it can only be given away. And Alina Ashford had never been fool enough to give hers to anyone who did not deserve it. If her silence spoke louder than 1,000 accusations, if you've ever known someone who chose dignity over defense, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment. What moment in this story hit you the hardest? Your words keep these stories alive. Subscribe so you never miss one. And remember, the truth doesn't need a voice when someone powerful enough decides to listen.